Alright, so welcome back to Dell of Merchants 2. First of all, you'll notice that this one here is actually from the first Dell of Merchants, the wily fellow, the thieving northern raccoons. Okay? But these two are both from Dell of Merchants 2. We have the little villain, intimidating dwarf crocodiles, and then we have the cunning neighbor, friendly fennec foxes. Now, which of these three do you think is the nicest of the three? If you picked the foxes, well, you would actually be wrong. They are actually very nasty. Now, in this game, you're always going to have, not always, it's an option, really, but there are definitely some cards that are more aggressive or that attack other players or ruin their hands or their decks, or prevent them from buying cards or certain cards and stuff like that. So there is definitely some of that in this game. And it really is reflective in these three cards here, this one being from the first one, and these two being from the second one. So if you don't like that, you don't have to necessarily play with them. But if you're thinking the crocodile is the biggest bully here, or the biggest villain here, you would be sadly mistaken. These friendly fennec foxes have quite the reputation, for sure. So, we're actually going to be talking about only one of these two cards, obviously, for this video, but I wanted to make a mental note and let you know that do not be fooled. Do not be fooled by friendly fennec foxes. At least these guys, if you take a look at these guys here, they might be the little villain, as it says. Alright? They might be intimidating. They might even threaten and harass you. But some of the stuff they sell is actually quite helpful. Like, for instance, they sell crutches. So if you get beaten up, at least they're going to give you something to, stabilize you so you don't, so you can walk around a bit. So they can help out a little bit. So they're not as nasty as they seem to be. But if you think these guys are in it to help you out, you'd be sadly mistaken. Even though that perhaps some of these here, like Charity, for instance, or even this tea set here, they might seem okay, and nothing wrong with that at all. It might even seem nice, but don't be fooled. Now, as far as aggressive goes, they're not that bad. Yeah, yes, it can destroy hands, but anybody can purchase these cards. Everybody starts with one of these each. Everybody can purchase these cards. And so it's not something that is going to be strictly with one person only having the attack cards, for sure. Okay, now, another thing I like about attack cards, though, is they add a lot of interaction. Not saying that there aren't other cards in Dell of Merchants that can add some interaction, but these here specialize in interaction. So if you want to have a game that allows you to interact with another player at least a little bit, then you're definitely going to want to play with at least one of these once in a while, for sure. Okay? But let's talk about one of these cards before time ebbs away. So let's talk about these guys first, since I keep saying they're not as bad or not as nasty as they appear, or at least compared to the fennec foxes. So here we have the little villain, intimidating dwarf crocodiles. Now, if you guys know me, you know I love crocodiles. So I'll play with this a lot, just because I like crocodiles. But if someone doesn't want to play with the crocodiles because they think it's too aggressive, well, we'll play with the Veld Chameleons from the first Dale of Merchants instead. Anyways, so this is a technique card. All opponents discard 2 cards from their decks one by one. So basically, the top 2 cards of their deck, they're going to discard one by one. That's what this technique is going to do. It's a really cool technique. I like that one a lot, for sure. Now, this will only affect those who have decks. There are times when a player will have 5 cards in their hand, and they will have a bunch, and the rest of their cards will be in the discard pile. If this technique is played, and a player doesn't currently have a deck, they aren't affected by it. So they won't be affected by this if that's the case. So, and there are cards that will affect the deck in a good way and a bad way. If that's the case, even if it's in a good way, they won't get the cool effect of the good effect if they don't have a deck. But the same is said for if it's a bad effect, they won't be affected by it if they don't have a deck currently. So, good or bad, you're not affected by any cards that affect the deck if you don't currently have one, but it's another player playing a card that makes you mess with the deck in a good way or a bad way. Okay, so that's the little villain. Now here we have the scary gunfight. This one isn't super bad, but this is a technique that says cards opponents purchase from the market cost +2 until the start of your next turn. So this is a technique that won't be fully satisfied until your next turn, okay? So that's something to note. But remember, while this is in play, all the other players, if they want to buy a card, it's going to cost them, if they want to buy a card from the market, it's going to cost them +2. So they might have to, they'll probably have to discard more cards to purchase. Or there might even be some cards they won't be able to purchase. Who knows? But that's a pretty smart move to play this card at certain times when there's a card you want to get and you don't want your opponents to get. Maybe you can't afford it right now, but you don't want them to get it, so you play this so that way they will probably be able to get it. That's a pretty smart move. Very strategic for sure. So I like that one a lot too. Okay, here we have the Night Shift, another technique. Draw a card from each player's deck. Choose one of them to place back on top of each player's deck. Okay, so this is kind of an interesting thing. Let's say you're playing with 3 people. 2 people, it's just going to be swap. It's just going to be a simple little swap. But if you're playing with 3 people, this is very effective if you're playing with at least 3 to 4 players. You're going to draw a card from each of the players' decks. So if you're playing a 3-player game, there's going to be 3 cards. Then you're going to look at all of them. You're going to choose one each to put back on top of each player's decks. So let's say the card you draw is a junk card. And then the other 2 cards you draw from the other player's decks, they were animal folk cards. They were cards that weren't junk cards, for instance. Then you could put one of them back on top of your deck, then put that junk card that was from your deck onto one of the other player's decks, and maybe even rearrange the other card that was on somebody else's deck and put it back on somebody else's deck. So that's a really cool ability for sure, especially if you're playing with more than 2 people. The Night Shift is definitely a cool technique for sure. Okay, moving on. Ruthless Competition, another technique. Draw a card from another player's deck and place it into your hand. Then choose one card from your hand to place back. So you draw, let's say you draw another card, a card from another player's deck. If you're playing with more than 2 people, you get to choose whose deck you're drawing from. And then, once you do that, you get to take a card from your hand and place it back on top of their deck. So let's say you take a card from their deck and it's a good card. Let's just say it's the Night Shift, for instance. Then you can give them another card from your hand. Maybe it's a, I don't know, maybe it's a junk card. You put that on top of their deck. Now they've got extra junk cards in their deck, and you have one of their good cards. So that's definitely a really cool card. Ruthless Competition for sure. Okay, so here we have Lost Shipments. This is another technique. And this is a technique that won't be fully satisfied, won't be fully finished until the start of your next turn. When filling their hands, each opponent can draw at most 1 card until the start of your next turn. So, normally, when your turn is done, you need to draw until you have 5 cards in your hand, normally. Okay, let's say they need to draw 3 more cards to make it 5. Okay? Well, if this is in play, they can only draw one more instead. So now, they needed 3. They could only draw 1. So now they only have 3 cards in there for their next turn. That's how that's going to work. They're only going to be able to draw 1 more card. So this one is definitely very powerful for sure to prevent them from drawing too many cards and having a strong next turn. That is definitely a cool one for sure. Okay, and then here we have the Nasty Threat. Stacks, this is another technique. Stacks opponent's build require +1 value until the start of your next turn. So what does that mean? Well, let's just say somebody was building their very first stack, and they were going to use one of their 1 cards to do it. Well, that means they would actually need a 2, because opponent's build requires +1 to the value. So it would now be a 2 instead of a 1, even though it's their first stack. So that means they might not even be able to do it. And if that's the case, they just can't simply do it this turn. They'll have to wait until this is gone, which won't be until the start of the player who played it, their next turn. So that's a very powerful card. And of course, that could also be useful in another way. Maybe you had, let's just say, for instance, you had enough cards to make the 8th stack, but right now you're currently making the 7th stack. You don't have the exact number for 7, but you have the exact number for 8, and somebody plays the Nasty Threat. Now, the 7th stall is currently an 8. Okay, that doesn't end the game, because they still have to build another stack that will be 8. But that could be useful if they only had that exact number currently for an 8 instead of a 7. So this could be useful even though it's meant to be an attack or to prevent people from building a stack. It could possibly also be useful to your opponent as well. So you just don't know. So that's still a really cool card. It can be helpful and it can be very unhelpful for sure. So that's another awesome card. So that's all of the cards for this critter merchant, the little villain. Okay, so we'll get to another animal merchant in the next video.